It was 1948 in Somerton Park, Australia. And as the man laid in the sand with his head against the seawall, he was dressed impeccably. I mean, he was looking like J-Fit yesterday at registration, you know. He had the shirt, he had the cufflinks on, he had the green suit. No, he wasn't wearing a green suit. But this man was laying on the beach, and as he was laying there, he had everything on. Cufflinks, the crisp white shirt that J-Fit could not get me to wear. Yet as the police began to approach him, they realized something. And what they realized is that this man was dead. He had perished. He was fully dressed, fully suited up, ready for some sort of event, ready for some sort of thing. But as he lay there on the beach, he was lifeless. And when the cops went up to him, they thought, what's with the suit? What's with it? So they took him, they bring him in, and when they brought him in, something even stranger happened. And what was stranger is that as they brought him in, he had no fingerprints, he had no ID on him, and when they put his name and photo in the paper, no one came to claim him. No one. He had no identity, he had no family, he had no community, he had no one. And to this day, no one knows what happened. No one knows what happened to the man and why he was lying there on that beach. And see, the reason I share this with you today is because in Ephesians 2, the text that I was tasked with sharing with you today, I believe that in Ephesians 2, 1 through 4, this is what Paul was trying to paint about you and I. Paul was trying to get us to understand something. He was trying to get us to see something. And when he was speaking in Ephesians 2, let's remember that his audience were people who were Gentiles. They'd never gotten to be in church before. And as he's writing to these people, he comes out guns blazing in verses 2, 1 through 4. He says, "As for you, you were dead." You were dead. You were gone. And he means this in a literal sense. He's like, hey, y'all, you, every one of us in this room, me, you, your family, your friends, we are all dead. And when he says this, he's using a very specific word to paint the picture of how we're dead. He uses the word nekros in the Greek. And as he uses this word, it's the same exact word Jesus uses when he says to the people, his disciples, let the dead bury their dead. Jesus is talking about a complete and total isolation of life being gone, of death, of destruction, complete absence of life. And at first, this can sound sort of offensive. You're like, hey, thanks, Kyle. You're telling us we're dead today. That's amazing. And when I read this, I'm like, man, Paul, this is really the message you wanted for these believers? For them to know that they're dead, for them to know that they're lifeless? But what I believe Paul was doing here is he was doing something important. What Paul was doing is he was giving us humanity's unifying feature. He was saying that here on this earth, our unifying anthem is death. And I think we all understand that. My little 80-year-old Italian grandmother, you wouldn't know because I have the red beard, okay, whatever, you know, but I am Italian, okay, with the last name Smith. Whatever, we'll talk about that later after service. She says this thing, she says, there's only two things I have to do. I have to die and pay taxes. Death is something we're all acquainted with. Yet after sharing this with us about death and it being our unifying feature, Paul says in Ephesians 2:4, one of the most theologically dense statements ever written, I believe. He tells us that you were dead. This is your unifying anthem. And then in verse 2-4, he says, but God. You were dead. You were gone. You were like the man lifeless on the beach with nowhere to go, no one to claim you, no identity, nothing. But God. But God stepped on the scene. But God showed up at your table. And when Paul says this, what we can take away from it in this room is that we all know that we have had seasons of our lives that have been solely based upon those two words, but God. Maybe you were going to lose the baby, but God showed up and did something. Maybe you were deserving of your spouse leaving you because you messed up, you did the wrong thing, but then God came in and he made it all healed, fixed, redeemed. I was addicted, full of shame, but God. I was a liar and a gossip. None of us Adventists know about that. But God. But God is the pivot point of every single thing in our lives. And I don't know about you, but oftentimes my but God moments are not the ones marked by something miraculous happening. Often for me, my but God moments are when I find myself broken, asking God why the miracle didn't happen. But God, why didn't it happen? But God, why? God, why? It seems like oftentimes when I'm broken, that's when I can discover God. And I think the reason for this, is because when I am surrounded by death, when we are surrounded by terrible things in this world, then and only then are we able to see the life that is truly life. In those dark moments, that's when we're able to see the light shining through the darkness, shimmering through all the terrible things happening around us. And what Paul wants us to know is that this is for everyone. This but God thing that can happen in our lives, it's not just for those people. It's not just for that person. Jesus' moment of coming into your life and doing something big is for everyone. Jesus is for all. Completely. And so because of this, Paul gives us some hope. You were dead. You were gone. Living with the sons of the spirit of wickedness. But then he says, but God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with him. Made us alive together with him. Paul says, because of our God, because of Jesus and his love, God has made us alive. And in saying this, Paul was giving us our new common denominator. He explains it very simply that at one point we were dead like the man on the beach, but now in verse 4, Paul proclaims that life is now our anthem. Life is now our unifying feature. Life is now the thing which draws us together, and it's the life we can live in. It's the way we can go about seeing the world, claiming life and victory. It is our new banner. And it isn't just any life. It's life united under something. Jesus isn't calling us to find life and new experiences. Jesus isn't calling us to find life like my friends I meet downtown in the dark parts of town who say that they find God through crystals or through energies or through. God isn't looking for us to find life in others. He wants us to find life in him. Jesus calls us into a life where we are alive together with Christ. We are alive together with Christ. Meaning a life in community, a life that is shared in the good and the bad, not only with Him, but with one another. No matter how dark or dead things still seem to get. I'll never forget sitting on the cold plastic chair in the waiting room when the doctor called us to come back. We were excited to be in that office again, my wife and I, after a year of trying to conceive, trying to get pregnant. With no luck, we were finally pregnant. Finally, it had happened. The time had finally arrived, and everything was going so smoothly. I mean, the morning sickness was coming in, and Annie was getting excited about that because it just showed that, it's finally happening. We're there. Everything was moving smoothly. And so as we went to the ultrasound that morning, I was hopeful. Like, everything's going to be good. Because last time we went, they did the ultrasound and they showed us the screen. And on the screen, there was this flickering. And the flickering was a heart. It was our potential child right there. Heart beating, screen flickering. But this time, as we sat in that cold room, and as Annie laid on that crispy wax paper, and you sit on it, you're always like, ooh. This time the image was static. There was no movement. There was no heartbeat. Nothing. Just death. Just brokenness. Just despair. And in that moment, if I can just be really transparent with you, this whole life of Jesus thing that I'm talking about today, it seemed like a sick joke. You ever felt that way before? You ever been sitting there in the car driving home after some, and you just start thinking, Jesus, wait, you really bring life? Because I'm not really seeing it. And it's been hard. The last couple of years have been overwhelming for us. Death has seemed like really the common thing for us. We've had 3 miscarriages, a year of complete infertility, 2 failed rounds of IVF now. And it's been paralyzing. It's exhausting. My soul is tired, y'all. And it's okay to admit that. We're a church. This is a safe place. Let's be vulnerable. Let's be open. And honestly, when we find ourselves in those moments, broken, hurting, life can be very hard to find. And if you're in this room today, I know that you've had these experiences. We've all had these experiences, and when this happens, it can feel like everything is hopeless. I mean, think about it. You lost your job that one time, or your wife said she was leaving, or whatever happened. You found out that your mother was terminally ill. In those moments, life can just seem like, man, it is so impossible to get my hands around, God. Why do you say it's there for me? I can't seem to find it. And when we get to that space, that's when I've realized the beauty of community. That's when I've realized that God has made us alive together for a reason. As Annie and I were sitting on the couch a couple months later after that miscarriage, we had just done our first round of IVF, and it failed. And IVF is supposed to work. I mean, like, it's the thing. You go into it and you're excited. We had 4 embryos. Kourtney Kardashian had done it before, so it must have been the right thing to do. Like it was going to work, right? This is the time. This is the one. But for us, it didn't. 25,000 later, 4 embryos that have passed later, we're still babyless. And like I said, it can be hard to sit there and feel hopeless. It can be easy to feel like you've hit a dead end until the doorbell rang for us. We were sitting there on the couch and the doorbell rang, and our friend Allie came to the door. And Allie's been journeying with us. She's been going through life with us. She goes to our church. She's on our vision team. And she came unannounced. It was a couple days after the IVF had failed. And as she approached us, she had a gift in her hands. She said, hey, I'm not going to stick around long. I'm just going to give you this gift. And then, Annie, Kyle, I want you to go sit down, and I want you to open it. And I remember as we were sitting there, Annie and I were hopeless. Annie and I were feeling in despair. Annie and I were like, man, this is not ever going to happen for us. But when we sat down with the book that Allie gave us, something incredible happened. It wasn't a coffee mug, right? It wasn't a special paper that says, God's got this, because we all love getting those when we're going through it. Just have faith, brother. I do. You know what I'm talking about. Just pray away. Just pray it away. No. I'll behave, J-Fit. Don't worry. As I sat there with Annie, we opened this package, and it was a book. And the book was a journal. And on every page of this book, friends from our community, friends from our church, church members, people who love us, people who care about us, each page was filled with scriptures and prayers and verses and thoughts and notes and messages. And they were all written from our friends to give us light in the midst of that darkness. They were written from our friends because they knew that they couldn't change the situation. They knew there was nothing they could do, but they knew that in that moment for us, they could show up. And you know what that meant for Annie and I? It meant that even though the terrible things were happening, even though the bad was going on, even though we were still sitting there childless, we knew we were not alone. We knew that we had a community. We knew that there are people who love us. We knew that there is a way to go forward. And friends, that's why I believe that it is so important that we understand this morning what it means to be alive together in Christ. It means to now, in the kingdom of life, here on this earth, bad things will still happen. They're still going to go down. But what it means is that in the midst of them happening, we have a family. We have a community. We have people who will gather around us, and they will look us in the eyes, and they will say to us, but God. I know you just lost the baby, but God. I know your wife just walked out, but God. I know your husband is, but God. They're there to remind us that God will still deliver us, that God is still good, and that Jesus is still going to see us through. And friends, I believe that when we become people pointing one another to life, when we allow ourselves to be the light in others' darkest moments, I believe when we do that, then in the words of Eugene Peterson, we can then become a church that is a colony of heaven and a country of death.